Hey all, Heretic here. Today in the Battlegrounds, we're covering all things beasts completely. We are going to be continuing our Back to Basics series here, where basically Season 9, we cover everything. We go over all the different things, we talk about all the minions, we talk about some builds theoretically since the season hasn't started yet, and then we lay it all out. And then as the season goes on, any changes will be listed in the comments below, and if worthy of a complete redo, we will completely redo it because we're starting super early and I want to cover them faster than I usually do. So hopefully I can keep these a little shorter so I can keep editing them and get them out to you on time. Let's jump right into it. All right, let us begin with the minions. Let's talk about all the different beasts and what they do. Some are simple, some are complicated. We're gonna cover them all. First, Mana Saber. Tier 1, 4/1, Death Rattle, summon 2/0/1 Cublings with Taunt. Basically, it's a Tier 1 minion. There are times when it's good, especially if you're playing something like Lich King, we can be really toxic, do some extra damage. But otherwise, if you run into anybody who says it has Divine Shield or a Death Rattle, this thing is going to hit it, possibly die, and then it's going to clear out your Cublings and you're going to lose. With the right hero in the right situation, this can be good. It's not a bad tier 1, but there certainly are better. Buzzing Vermin is a 1/1 beast that has Taunt, Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 Beetle. Basically, you have a way to now pop Divine Shields in the early game and then summon out a minion that's a little better. I think this is a good tier 1 minion. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a monster. It's just good for what it does. Next up at tier 2, we have Hummingbird. This is a 1/4 start of combat. For the rest of this combat, your beasts have +1 attack. An aura effect, doesn't matter when it dies, so you can bump with this thing if it's your weakest beast. It gives its effect and then you don't care anymore. It's good in the early game, otherwise it falls off pretty fast if you have a Mana Saber, say, or if you have a Buzzy Vermin already. Instant value on this thing, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. In the early game, you're going to cut it pretty quick later though. Hungry Snapjaw is a 5/2 beast that is, after you summon a beast, gain 1 health permanently. Is fantastic in the early game if you have either of the tier 1 beasts, but falls off pretty quick. So even if you have a bunch of summons, this thing can get up to 30, 50 health, but it's got 5 attack, and that's kind of where it falls apart. Yeah, it can take a punch, but boy, it doesn't really give much into that mid and late game. You're definitely cutting this. But that being said, say you have a Mana Saber or 2 and this can definitely carry you for quite a while. Jumping up to tier 3, we have some of the mainstays, some of which might be sitting on your board for the rest of the game, depending what build you're going for. We're going to start with the Monstrous Macaw. This 4/3, after this attacks, trigger your leftmost Death Rattle, except this minion's, is a mainstay of beast boards. It doesn't matter what you're running. If you have Death Rattles, which you usually do as a beast board, this thing can do the job pretty well. And let's face it, Macaw works in a lot of different builds because it is targeted Death Rattle trigger. This is a very solid minion that is worth being on a lot of different boards, but excessively so on a beast board. Sprightly Scarab is a 2/1, choose one, give a beast +1/+1 and reborn, or 3/3 and taunt. Remember, you can use this for a taunt. You almost never will use this for a taunt, but if you're desperate, it does do the job. What you use this for is reborn. You're giving that Macaw reborn. You're giving your Goldrinn later reborn. You're giving your Beetles reborn so you can summon more of them. There's just so much value. This card is so impactful to a beast board, but you're never gonna see it on your damn beast board. It's just one of those cards you never really can get enough of. So definitely Sprightly Scarab works great. Now we have the Forest Rover. Now this 4/2 beast is Battle Cry. Your Beetles have +2/+1. This game, Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 Beetle. Now this is one of the first minions in the beast tribe that I'm considering just straight up direction. You find this thing, you play it, all your Beetles get 2/1. All the ones on the board, all the ones you summon. It's an aura effect. And the fact that it then summons a Beetle makes it pretty damn effective in the early game because you can use this in conjunction with other beasts like Rylak, we're going to see in a minute. And then you could just have it do its thing. If you could trigger this multiple times, so you're playing Shudderwalk, you can just keep hitting this over and over again. Hell, it just works. This is a really good minion, and it's going to be the start probably of your Beetle build, really. Bird Buddy is a 2/4 neutral that's only in beast lobbies, but it has a Venge 1, give your beasts +1/+1. Well, I mean, while this isn't great late game, in the mid game, and especially in the early game, this thing is dominant. You get a bunch of death rattles, reborn, summons, and it buffs all of your beasts. You really cannot go wrong. Is this going to be on your late game board? Well, if it is, you probably died pretty fast. But if it's not, you're in good shape. Use this through the mid game and just let it carry you to that late game, and just recognize when it's time to cut it, because you much rather have something like a Titus or just another death rattle minion to give you more value typically, unless you have some really weird stuff going on and you're just having really odd luck. We have a whole bunch of beasts at tier 4. We're going to start with Rylak Metalhead because I've already talked about it a little bit. This is the 5/3 beast taunt. Death rattle, trigger the battle cry of an adjacent minion. Well, this is probably the first time in a long time, if ever, that we've had a beast with a battle cry in the lobby. So the fact that we can get a Forest Rover, get it next to a Rylak, and give a permanent buff to all of our beetles just makes this thing disgusting when used in concert with that. You give this Reborn from the Spriteling and it just starts to get insane. And I feel like this is the kind of thing that's going to help the beast builds really snowball when they're using beetles. Rylak is just a damn good card in a lot of builds, and now it finally works with the beast tribe. Sly Raptor is a 1/3 death rattle, summon a random beast, set its stats to 7/7. It's not a great beast if it's just there by itself. It does summon a 7/7, which isn't bad tempo for tier 4. So tripling into this early makes it a very powerful grab. But if it's your only beast, you're not super happy that you have it beyond the 7/7 it summons. This is something you don't mind using with a Goldrinn build, of course. You don't really like this with any kind of beetle setup, but it just works in general for a stat stick. Karmic Chameleon is a 4/6 Avenge 5. Transform into a copy of the minion to the left of this. You take this, you put it away on the right side of your board, you put it next to your Titus or a Rune Progenitor, you let it turn into a copy of one of them, and you milk value. This is good so you can at least have 2 of something that maybe you can't find either the triple of or the second copy of. The problem is the Avenge 5, so it's going to take time to get the value for it. So if by the time it turns into the copy, it's too late for that to be worth it, this is not a great fit for your board. But if it's something where you can still milk value out of it, I definitely feel like this is a great card, typically on your beast boards. Turquoise Skitter is up next. This 2/4 death rattle. Your beetles have +1/+2 this game, and it summons a 2/2. Now, this is one of the directional beasts, I feel also. Now, when you find this, if you already have a Forest Rover, or you get the Turquoise Skitter and you can see a Forest Rover, and that's pretty instant direction. The earlier the better, obviously, because you need to get these things scaling permanently online fast. But I really feel like this is one of those direction minions. You can use this in conjunction with a Monstrous Macaw. You can reborn it with a Scarab. You can get a Titus Rivendare. There's so many ways you can milk value out of this thing in the beast board that it's just incredibly powerful and has a very long-term potential that a lot of builds don't give you, because the earlier you get this, the earlier you start that permanent scaling on all of your beetles, and you're going to have a lot of beetles since most of them tend to be low tier. Really feel like this is going to be a very key minion, at least in its current form. Jumping up to tier 5, we have the Primate. This is a 3/9 pirate beast that is after a friendly death rattle minion dies, gain 1 gold next turn. This card, when found early with some death rattles, is amazing. One of the best things you can get in that early mid game. But if you find this late, typically putting this on your board is just greedy. Its stat line is not insanely valuable, especially into the late game. And its effect, while good, isn't going to help you if you die. So I definitely wouldn't have this on my board if I was anywhere near or under cap. The second you're under that 15 and you're looking at death, this thing has got to be gone. Otherwise, you are going to die with a lot of gold for your next shop phase. Unfortunately, it doesn't carry over to your next game. Neozawa is a 7/6. Whenever this attacks, deal damage equal to its attack to another random enemy minion. So the moment this goes to attack, the first thing it does is it takes whatever its attack value is and it hits a random enemy. Now the key is another, so it's not ever going to hit your taunt target. So if their taunt has divine shield, just be ready, this thing is going to hit it with its face. There's no way it's going to get hit first with this ability and then it's going to punch it. So it's going to hit something random. Now that is the strength of this minion though, is that you can snipe anything. You can hit the best target on the board, or you can hit the worst. You don't get any control of it either, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. I love this minion, but not really in a beast board, where beast boards aren't about doing permanent buffs to all beasts, just beetles right now. Having a Niazawa is hard to scale up typically. In a menagerie board, I love this thing. Please put it in every menagerie board. Let it throw its attack all over the place. But putting this in a normal board for beasts feels like you have to be greedy, because it's either got to be relatively small and not that good, or you have to have your Goldrins trigger a whole bunch before it's mediocre. And I really feel like most other beasts would fit in your board better, typically. Mechanized Gift Horse is a 4/4 mecha beast, Death Rattle summon to 2/2 mecha horse with Death Rattle summon a 1/1 mecha pony. Now this is good if you're running a lot of Avenge, if you're running a mech board and you need resets for your Deflecto, if you're running a Goldrinn, you could definitely get a ton of value out of this. For beast boards, I like this with a Goldrinn build. It's summoning a ton of more minions that are all going to be buffed by that Goldrinn aura. My issue is, of course, that it's not permanent stats, it's temporary scaling, so it can fall behind anyone who has potentially infinite scaling. There's no way you're beating that because you have a cap with how big your minions can get. That being said, Mechanized Gift Horse in a solid Goldrinn build can terrify some boards. Nest Swarmer is a 6/6 beast, Death Rattle summon 3/2/2 beetles. Now, here is the question on this. Is it good? Well, have you buffed your beetles at all? Because if you've had, say, 2, 3, 20 triggers of your beetles, this is insane. Have you triggered it twice, the buffs? I mean, if you triple into this, that's still good early. If we're talking like turn 7, 8, you've got a Nest Swarmer and you've got just a little bit of scaling going. This is phenomenal because those beetles are a lot bigger than it's summoning and it's already a 6/6 body. So early, that's solid. But if you haven't buffed it and we're getting in the mid-late game, it's not going to be worth your time unless you see everything in the shop that you can steal to make this thing buff quickly. That being said, it does work in a Goldrinn build also. It's still a beast that summons 3 beasts. So if you have a Goldrinn, you have a Macaw, you have a Titus, you can still scale the hell out of these tokens. So it's still going to work well in a Goldrinn build. Ruined Progenitor is a 2/7 Avenge 4. Your beetles have +2/+2 this game. Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 beetle. Is this good? Well, we have to check some boxes first if I can tell you this is actually good. In a void, completely void, you get to tier 5, it's turn 8, you've got no other beetles, you haven't buffed them at all. Is it good? Well, let's say you also have a bunch of Death Rattle minions that summon things, not beetles. You can start scaling your beetles pretty fast. All the other beetles are tier 5 and lower. That means it's usually pretty easy to find them, and that means it could be very good. If you find this late and you have no Death Rattles, probably not going to be useful. If you find this and you've already had beetles going for a little bit, various other Death Rattles, say you have 2 or 3, not all of them, and you've had a couple beetles die, and you've got a couple of those beetle minions on there that are giving you that long-term value. This can get really insane really quick, and I feel like can really scale your board forever. And I also feel like, and I don't take offense to this, but at lower MMR, this build is going to do better because it's easier to put together. There's nothing complicated. You look for minions that say beetles, and you grow them. That's it. Anyone can do that. You don't need to think about it too much. You can be drunk out of your mind sitting here going, all right, is it a beetle? It's a beetle, and you play them and you win. So yes, Ruined Progenitor, gonna be a fit for any beetle build. At tier 6, we have a lot of old friends we'll cover quickly, but one Amalgam Tour Group, 6/7, whenever you play a card, give a friendly minion of its tier or lower +1/+1. I don't ever want this on my beast board, but if you get it and you know you're going to cycle some cards, make sure you play this first. cycle the cards that you don't care about to buff the cards you do care about, then sell it. That's all it should be doing on your beast board. Arid Atrocity is a 7/7 all death rattle summon, a 7/7 golem, improved for each friendly minion type that died this combat. Now, I don't know if that's any different from the previous Atrocity. I haven't seen it in play yet, but in a beast board, it still works a little bit. It will get in the way of the other things you want to summon, and the important part is the golem you summon, at least before, was a neutral and not tribe associated, thus it was not buffed by anything. If it was a beetle, if it was a beast, it would be great. But it's not an all type, the golem. Usually it's just a neutral. If they've changed that, this could fit in a lot of different beast builds, including beetles and Goldrinn. Why not? But that being said, this is best in Menagerie or as an early triple for power. Otherwise, Ghoul-acabra is a 4/13 undead beast. After a friendly death rattle minion dies, give your minions +2/+1 permanently. Is not something you usually want on your beast boards late or at all. But if you find it early and you have a few death rattles, it's not bad to bring up your base stats. Just be prepared. You're going to cut this at some point. It's probably going to be bigger than what you want it to be. But don't wait till you find the spell to cut this. Just take this thing and get rid of it when you find the thing that makes your board better. Do not hesitate to replace this with a Titus or a Macaw out front for extra triggers. The stats this give are not meaningful enough in the long-term value of most beast boards. Indomitable Mount is a 3/6 beast death rattle summon, a random beast from 3, 4, and 5. Now, this has received a massive buff in this patch to me, because at 3, 4, and 5 we have a lot of very effective beetles. And guess what? We love summoning things in a beetle board. So normally I would say this is a great fit for a Goldrinn board, and it still is, because no matter what you summon, Goldrinn is going to take advantage of it. It's like, here's your buffs. But the beetles giving permanent buffs often makes the Indomitable Mount in a beetle board very, very tasty. Now, late in the game, do you want this still? Maybe not, because maybe you'd rather just have minions that guarantee summon beetles, right? But at the same time, if it's gold and reborn and sitting towards the back, you might want to keep it anyways, because it is going to summon a lot of things, and those effects could be permanent and a big deal. But at the same time, it could give you random things that don't do anything. So pick your poison. You'll know when it fits on your board, and there'll be times when you don't cut it and you wish you had, but if it's big enough and it's doing enough for you, just keep it, don't worry about it. Finally, we have Goldrinn, 3/3 beast death rattle for the rest of this combat. Your beasts have +3/+3, is a mainstay of beast boards, and while I feel not as good as the Beetle build, still good. Now, the Beetle build I prefer because they're permanent stats forever. That is huge. Goldrinn is going to spike really hard, but then every combat you reset back down to nothing. I don't like that as much. That makes it easier to trigger death rattles because you know they're going to die, but at the same time, it makes them less likely to click in the correct order, and then you get murdered before the things happen that you need to happen. That being said, Goldrinn is still going to work. Typically, when you find Goldrinn, that's when you know you're playing Goldrinn, so it's kind of hard to say worry about this build at any other point in the game. Don't try to make a build around a tier 6 minion, even remotely early. You never should. This isn't something you decide to play until you find the Goldrinn. And just to be a completionist, tier 7, we have Papa Bear, the 8/8 beast. Whenever you summon a beast, give it +8/+8. Sucks. I had a little bit of hope when I saw the change, because I didn't really love the Mama Bear setup, but this feels even worse. I've never seen anyone be able to really pull it off, ever. I have not played one game where somebody won because of or with the help of this minion. I've seen it a number of times, but it's never done a damn thing. So for the most part, if you have to play Papa Bear, just be happy if you can finish in the top 4. Don't worry about trying to win with this thing. It's going to be very rare this does anything in a Goldrinn or a Beetle board. Finally, we have to cover the spell Boon of Beetles. This is a tier 4 1 gold spell. Whenever you have space in combat, summon 2/2/2 beetles and give them taunt to left. I like that because it's going to summon them when you have room for them. Obviously, this is a pretty useful spell. You're going to be summoning beetles. Well, if you have any beetles buffing going on, they're going to be better than 2/2, and you're getting 2 of them for 1 gold when there's space on your board, which is a big deal. Goldrinn this even works fine with, because once again, Goldrinn dies, buffs your aura up, these things appear, gain it, you're all set. And there are taunts in your way, which is always good for a beast board, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. Just remember, they're always going to appear on the right side of your board. So remember, if you have an opponent who's running a large cleave and it's not in the number 1 position, your Titus or whatever else you have that was in the tier 7 slot might now be vulnerable to that cleave. So try to keep positioning in mind when you play this, that you don't accidentally get yourself killed. All right, the first build we're going to open with is going to be an old classic that you probably already know, but I need to include it for the newer players who might just be wandering in. And there are some changed minions for this season, and that is going to be the Goldrinn Build. It's pretty simple. When do I start playing this build, Heretic? I've got some random minions on my board. When do I want to decide I'm a Goldrinn Build? And that's easy. If you have a couple Death Rattle beasts that summon more beasts, and you see a Goldrinn in the shop or you triple into it, that's when you're probably going to switch to this build. This is the first sign that you are doing it. You need Goldrinn because it's so pivotal for this build to actually work and not just kind of fall short of being anything decent. So the very first thing you're looking for, the main minion you need to start it, is going to be Goldrinn. After that, the other 2 pieces that I consider pivotal to this build, other than the obvious more beasts that summon beasts, are going to be Monstrous Macaw and Titus Revendare. The reason for that being is, well, Goldrinn just doesn't trigger enough by itself to justify just it. You need to have the Macaw to trigger out those extra triggers, and you need to have the Titus to give you those additional ones too. That multiplier effect of Titus is just massive. And always, tripling Titus is priority because everything on your board is Death Rattle based, thus getting this tripled will make a huge difference. So at any time you can do that immediately. Now, what are the other pieces and parts we're looking for to flush this build out? Now, we're going to look at the cycle options first. These are cards that you typically don't really see on your opponent's board, or they're very temporary, but they are still important. Other than the obvious taunts, we're looking for things like Sprightly Scarab to give Reborn to our various minions. We want to have that Goldrinn. We want to have that Macaw Reborn. I always advise Reborn the Goldrinn first, especially if you've taunted the Goldrinn, because if the Macaw has Reborn, but the Goldrinn does not, and the Goldrinn dies first, your Macaw is just triggering other Death Rattles, which can be good. Keep positioning in mind. Sometimes you want that, but typically you're going to want to triple that Goldrinn as much as possible. So try to keep that in mind when doing it. Otherwise, you're looking for things like Boon of Beetles. Basically, on cooldown, you want to cast this spell as much as possible because, hey, Goldrinn buffs beasts, beetles are beasts, and it's extra taunts to get in the way to give you time to get those triggers and get your Death Rattles happening in the correct order. As always, be careful of Boon of Beetles. If you know your opponent's running a cleave, just remember it's going to pop in at that far right position on your board where your Titus is usually hiding out, and it's very possible that he will get sniped. So position accordingly if that is the opponent you're fighting. And as always, keep an eye out for Eyes of the Earth Mother. Why? Well, you need to make things gold, and obviously this is the easiest way to do it. Basically, for me, the only real target for this is Monstrous Macaw. You can target some of your other Death Rattle minions, but typically they're not worth the gold or the effort. Macaw, though, if you haven't found the second one, I instantly want this instead of digging for extra Macaws. It's just easier to make it gold immediately. So we have the main part. We have the cycle cards. What's the rest of our board going to be filled out with? And those are completely optional, what you find, what you feel works best. But initially, obviously, Mana Saver's not bad. It's 1 beast that summons 2. We've got a Goldrinn buffing, so value there. It's going to be something like Sly Raptor, which is just going to die and summon another beast. The only problem with Sly Raptor is it only summons 1, so not a overwhelming value, but still value nonetheless. Next, we're going to look for something like Mechanized Gift Horse, because this is probably one of the best beasts, as it summons out a beast that summons out 2 beasts that summons out beasts. And if you have a Titus in the back, you're just getting a lot of tokens in the way that have been buffed by this Goldrinn, so easy value there. Nest Swarmer is a new one, is a great fit because it is a big minion that summons out a bunch of little minions. And yeah, it's just positioning. You have to keep it in mind when it's going to trigger to make room for all these summons. And if it's Reborn, where can you hide it? Will you ever get the full value out of it? Either way, it summons a lot of things, so it's good. Finally, Indomitable Mount, of course, works because guess what? Mount summons 3 random beasts. So that gives you decent potential to summon out a bunch of the beasts we've just mentioned, but also a bunch of really random beasts that may or may not help you. So, as always, random summons, user beware. But they are always beasts, So there is value in that for Goldrinn, and it definitely makes that a lot more valuable. Now, this is how I would play Goldrinn, how I would in the new season. I think it's going to be fairly easy that Nest Swarmer fits in this build nicely, but this is our initial thoughts. Tell me what you think. Am I crazy? Am I off? What have I forgotten? Or is Goldrinn basically so vanilla and so easy? Of course, this is what you do. All right, Beetle players, are you ready to build your board? Heretic, we want to play Beetles. We're excited, and I have to cover the ground rules about Beetles. So all the minions that have the ability to buff Beetles and Death Rattle summon Beetles are not Beetles. They are beasts. Yes, they look like giant beetles. I would argue they probably are giant beetles, but at some point they no longer can be counted as beetles for some reason in their evolution. Please, everyone who wants to argue and tell me how they're beasts and they should be fine being in the beast tribe, I understand, but I'm just confused how they are not beetles, but they spawn beetles. Are the beetles parasites living on them? I don't know. It's a fantasy world. I guess I shouldn't think too hard about it, but it feels really weird. But the only thing you are buffing are the things that are summoned from these beetles. There's no normal way you're going to be summoning them in the shop phase or anything or buying them out. They're only going to come out during the combat phase. Now, there are a lot of beetles that we could say are the starting point, but I'm going to argue that you can't say you're playing a beetle board. I'm going to say first, it's going to be Rune Progenitor. Typically, that is going to be the engine that will scale up all of your stuff that you want to hide in the back to take as much advantage of as possible. Next, I'm going to say Titus Rivendare. Most everything on your board is based around death rattles, so you definitely want to have a Titus giving you those extra triggers. Now, there are other times when you could say, this makes me play Beetles also, and it definitely can work, and that's going to be with something like Turquoise Skitterer. I'm also going to consider this a main part of this build because every time it dies, it's going to permanently buff your Beetles. And between all the different ways we can take advantage of getting multiple triggers, this is going to be a great unit. And it should not shock you at all when I say Monstrous Macaw typically is going to work in this build. Now, where you position it, when it should be triggering is difficult to say because when you have something like a Turquoise Skitter, triggering the Death Rattle is great to get those permanent buffs, but at the same time, you'd really love to also get the Death Rattle to pop out. So there is that whole question of where and when do you position it. You know, take those chances when you can to get the maximum value of the summon out, but sometimes also just getting the buff itself is enough justification to use this. I feel like this is a lot of value typically in this board, so Macaw is a good fit, at least in the beginning stages. At the very end, you might want to cut this if you're using it primarily to buff the scaling end on it, and not so much to just kick out extra minions because there's just no space. But otherwise, this is a great minion typically in this board. And next, we're going to look at the options that we have, because there's a couple different ways. In addition to this, you could put as main pieces in the early game, but realistically are scaling up options. That's going to be a thing like Forest Rover. You're going to be cycling Forest Rover as much as possible, but also if you can use this in conjunction with, say, a Rylak Metalhead, which is weird in a beast board, using a Rylak, you can use it to trigger this battle cry over and over again with those permanent increases in your stats. For things you're going to want to be cycling as much as possible, I'm going to look at something like Sprightly Scarab, because you want to reborn all of these minions, and the sooner you get that done, the better, because that is just going to give you all the additional charges you need. I would start with reborning the Death Rattle. We want to make sure that Turquoise Skitterer is getting triggered extra times. So that is probably the primary one I want to typically reborn, but otherwise, you start getting the ones who are going to give you the permanent value as long as you have enough health to make that work. You probably should be reborning the ones who are actually going to make you win the fight, but otherwise try to get the ones that are going to give you permanent scaling, as that's better value. When it comes to cycling with spells, I'm going to say you want to do as much as possible, of course, Boon of Beetles, because hey, you're a beetle board. It turns out putting extra beetles on the board makes it work. So Boon of Beetle spells a must, and also Eyes of the Earth Mother. So many of the important minions are tier 4 and lower that you can get good value by throwing this out here on the minions that need it. Typically, I would start with Macaw, but the Skitter is also a good choice if you haven't managed to triple that yet, and it's early enough because that being gold is extra permanent scaling. And of course, anything that is low enough tier that making it gold makes it more likely that you're going to win the fight is worth this. For the minions you're going to want to have permanently on your board that are just basically the summoning bodies of your board, it's going to be Buzzing Vermin to a very much lesser degree. This is probably the one you want to cut first when you're looking to cut one of them. And then finally, I would say Nest Swarmer, just because it does summon 3. It is just a good solid beast already and is going to help you get that board lined up with some actual beetles that get summoned out. Now, other optional minions you could put on this board, I'm going to start with Mutated Lasher or Goldrinn can both fit on this board. Goldrinn will buff everything, all of your different beasts. Lasher will only buff the odd tier ones, but all of the beetles you summon are tier 1, thus Lasher will buff them all, kind of being a pseudo slightly downgraded version of Goldrinn in this case. Both phenomenal for a quick bump of power that might not be enough to win you the game, but definitely enough to help you find the pieces. Indomitable Mount can fit on this board. It does summon tier 3, 4, and 5, which are all beetle tiers, so can give you scaling, but it is random, so we never know what it's going to give us. That being said, if you have one extra slot and you're looking for something to put down, if anything, just to give more death rattles for your runed progenitor, you can get some really good value out of their Indomitable Mount. And you can use a mechanized gift horse on this board if you're, say, just trying to buff your beetles and you have a runed progenitor going. You put this in a position where it's going to have room to summon out all of its death rattles, and that's going to give you a bunch of Avenge, which will be the permanent buffing of the beetles, so you can't go wrong. Overall, the beetle board has a lot of potential. It has almost infinite growth, right? The longer the game goes, these stats can just shoot forever and ever and ever. But you got to have some lucky hits, you got to have timing, and you need to find them early enough so you can start scaling them. Otherwise, someone is going to grow big and just roll right over you while your beetles are still tiny. Remember, your board itself isn't going to get big. It's going to kind of stay where it is. It's those death rattles that are getting permanently big and will give you the most value in the long run. So definitely scale this up early as fast as you can, and then you can go really nuts and have a good time. But initially, you want to be greedy and you want to scale as much as you can. Finally, let's take a look at a more menagerie style build and something that I consider beast adjacent, because beasts are one of the 2 tribes that do this build best, and that is going to be the Mutated Lasher build. Lasher's pretty easy. Lasher is going to buff all of your odd tier minions, and more importantly, all of the things they summon. Now, most tokens that are summoned out of beasts or undead or anything for that matter typically are tier 1 because they are tokens and thus odd tier. There are examples that don't, like Indomitable Mount, which you could use in this build because it is a tier 6, but it does summon a tier 3 and a 5 in addition to the 4. The 4 wouldn't get the buff, but the 3 and the 5 both would. So something like that would work in this build, but it isn't necessarily something we want in this build if we can help it, because there are tons of odd tier minions that are just phenomenal that would suit this purpose better, I feel like, more consistently. So if we have the Mutated Lasher in the main part of this build, what else falls in this category? For me, that is going to have to be both Monstrous Macaw and Titus Rivendare. The reason for that's really easy. Multipliers of this death rattle. If we don't have any permanent scaling on our board, because Lasher's buffs are temporary, we need to absorb as many triggers of this as possible so we can spike really hard. This is not going to be an infinite scaling board that starts shooting pretty early. It can if they're starting to come into their own late in the game, but once they hit, you have a ceiling on how big you can get. No matter what, if you golden everything, you can only get so big typically with this build. Meanwhile, they can scale forever. Now, for the things we're going to cycle while doing this build, it's going to feel very similar to all the others because these just work really well. First, we're going to have Sprightly Scarab because we want to reborn every beast we have that's summoning more beasts because, hey, it makes sense. Now we get more value. Now, the first things you want to reborn is typically going to be that Macaw because extra triggers of the Lasher, again, are the way to go. So definitely that is something you want to look into with this. Now then, alternatively, other things we want to be cycling, Boon of Beetles, of course, we want to cycle because they don't start on our board. When space opens up on our board, they slide in, and you've got it. They're odd tier, so they gain all those other buffs you might have gotten on Beetles during the game, and the Lasher buffs right there. And of course, Eyes of the Earth Mother, so you can make your minions golden so they're better. And in case of this, the best target, of course, is always the Monstrous Macaw, because triple death rattle triggers are just damn good on a Lasher, so you can get more stats. Now, the minions that we're going to use to fill this build out are surprisingly easy to find for the most part. Obviously, some are going to be better than others, and you will want to fill those spots with the better ones you can find, of course. But some of the best examples for me both only exist in Undead and Beasts, and that is Buzzing Vermin. We're looking at Harmless Bonehead, Mana Saber. We're going to have the Handless Forsaken, the Cadaver Caretaker. Probably after that, I'm going to be looking up at the higher tiers for stuff, and that's going to be the Nest Swarmer, because it does summon those 3 beetles. And finally, probably the MVP is going to be something like Mechanized Gift Horse, because, hey, it's odd tier. That has a death rattle that summons out odd tier, that has a death rattle that summons out odd tier. So you're just throwing so many different tokens to buff out of this thing. This is probably the MVP minion. And hey, if you could have a mutated Lasher with a Titus and a golden reborn Macaw, obviously all gold perfect, right? And then just a sea of mechanized gift horses, this would probably be ideal, but there you go. Now, could you transition this into a Goldrinn build? Well, it depends how many of the undead and other random things we've picked up to fill the slots. Obviously, Goldrinn will work a little better because it buffs everything. But if you've already got a fully set up odd board, there's no real reason to switch to the Goldrinn unless it is just a straight up upgrade, and it's not going to be a significant one. Since it's higher tier, it's usually harder to find more of them, and the Lasher is just earlier to be found and more abundant, so it's always kind of the way to go. Now, this build I've done a couple times. It does work pretty well. Of course, we've got to play a lot more games to flush it out, but initially, especially at lower MMRs, with this being easier to find, you can really guarantee yourself a top 4 with an early hit on this minion. And overall, this is Beast. This is how they work. This is what they do. This is how beetles interact with things. I think they're an interesting tribe with some potential. Do I think they might receive some buffs? Possibly, or it could just be other tribes receive a lot of nerfs. I think they're pretty cool, and I'm really looking forward to playing them. Now, this is my first return to the Back to Basics for this season, so please leave me a comment, like and subscribe for the video. I would appreciate it. But I don't know if these videos are good if you don't comment. Give me more than the thumbs up and thumbs down, although I'd love the thumbs up. I do need to know what you think, what we could do different. Thanks for watching again. I appreciate it, and I hope you learned some things. I'll see you in the Battlegrounds. Later.